So, good evening, everybody. We continue with our lecture on representation. We have lecture 3 today, and we will be concerned about death. Death cannot be depicted. Death has no referent. The ideas we have of death are determined by the various media through which the concept itself is conveyed to us: language, visual representations, and rituals. Art has produced countless visual representations that have to do with death. Death is, after all, the existential topic par excellence that preoccupies man, and art grapples with existential questions. Experiencing death is part of human existence. Having to experience death is an anthropological constant. The way in which we deal with death are reflected in the media of representation. Likewise, the ways in which death is represented shapes the ideas we have of dying and death. How death is variously treated in terms of semantics is determined in each case by historical and cultural factors. If death per se cannot be depicted, how can it nevertheless be made visual? I propose to present you various modes of representing death: personifications, allegory, or so-called realistic depictions of persons who are dying or dead. We shall concentrate here on Christian culture. But first I would like briefly to review the sources on which Christian, that is European Christian art, has drawn. That's very superficial, but I just want you to show that, Christianity didn't invent everything. In Egypt, life was oriented towards life after death, so that's very similar to Christianity. This initially concerned only the pharaoh and his closest entourage. Pyramids, sacrificial offerings, the conception that the deceased were to continue living as they had done in the earthly world. A crucial notion was that the soul, which was called Ba, could reunite with a fully preserved, mummified body. But in Mesopotamia, there were also other quite different conceptions of death. Gilgamesh, of the Gilgamesh epic, appeals to the living to make the most of life, since all that awaits them after death is despair and oblivion. Here, death is seen as the end of a life of self-determination and the beginning of a shadow existence, which where then can be no coming to terms, not even with the help of lavish tombs or funerary objects. On tablet X of the Gilgamesh epic, one reads, I quote, "Gilgamesh, where are you heading in such a haste? You will never find this life you are seeking. Make every day a joyous feast, dance and play night and day, for such is the work that mankind is to accomplish." End of quote. Considering the great efforts made to provide materially for a life after death, there could hardly have been two more contrasting conceptions of death, and yet both shared the same basic goal, namely the survival of the deceased in the memory of posterity, thanks to accomplished deeds. In the story, Gilgamesh then has a wall built around the city of Uruk in order to ensure his immortal glory. little knowledge do we have about Greece. We have this sepulchral stele, as you see this, and we have, there is an idea of Hades. But you don't have this orientation towards an afterlife, which itself lacks close definition. Everyone ends up going to Hades. Only a select few become demigods, like Heracles, and then they are able to live eternally in heaven. The shades, spirits or ghosts of the dead that eternally roamed the underworld, suffered no pain, but they knew no happiness either. And then only in later conceptions you have the idea of Tartarus. This is a lower part of the underworld, and there you have some punishments. It was only in later periods that different conceptions took shape. Plato and the notion that the soul lived eternally. But in contrast, Epicure, in his gorgeous dialogue, Plato describes a judgment. The righteous proceed to a pleasant place, namely the island of blessed. The unrighteous, meaning especially those who have held power and politicians, go to Tartarus. Also in the Phaedon, Plato has Socrates speak about hell. In hell there are punishments that are very differentiated. When the sinners manage to understand the wrong they have done, they are freed from their torments. This is in complete contrast to Christianity, of course, where the punishment is permanent. In Rome, you have this notion of Gloria. Ancestor, you have this worship of ancestor, conceptions of the underworld. You have this, for instance, in Virgil's Aeneas. Aeneas is led through the underworld by a Sibyl, in which specific sins such as murder, theft, are punished. But at the same time, Lucretius in the 1st century BC considered that the concept of hell was unable to achieve the desired goal, namely that of instilling fear of punishment and thereby contributing to a more moral life. Life itself was true hell, the concept of hell being merely an allegory of life. So what is important is that you see that you have so different conceptions of thereafter. In Judaism, you have the word of Sheol. Sheol, the meaning of the term is not altogether clear. In the Septuaginta, it's translated as Hades. It's poorly defined. It's a sort of underworld, a world of deep darkness. For the Jews, what is significant is the notion that posterity lives on. Sheol is not a place of punishment. It is merely a place of gloom. Sheol is difficult to translate. It's a realm of the dead. It's a possible approximation. Luther, in his German translation of the Bible, was the first to call it Hölle or hell. But you see, one always has to pay attention on these translations, because with a translation, of course, so many things are changed. Everyone, whether good or wicked, ends up in Sheol. In Judaism too, it was only in the last centuries before the Christian era that conceptions of an afterlife began to take shape. In later Judaism, after the return from the Babylonian exile of 587 BC, and especially beginning with the 2nd century BC, the beginnings of a concept of an afterlife begins. The experience of living a grateful present gives rise to a yearning for a different and a better life after death. The existence of a notion of hell, but understood as meaning that on the day of judgment the wicked shall not resurrect. In Christianity, a notion of fundamental importance is that death is overcome through Christ. Christianity is a hereafter religion. The plan of life is drawn up, as it were, with death in mind. The sources from which Christian conception of death and the hereafter emerged include late Judaism, especially the Jewish apocalyptic literature, Greco-Roman antiquity, in particular Plato, and Egyptian antiquity. In the Gospels themselves, there are only scanty indications of a hereafter. In the Gospel of Luke, for example, no mention whatsoever is made of an afterlife. Matthew, at least, goes into some detail. Allow me to quote, I quote Matthew, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left." So you see, this is how this is depicted in very early Christian mosaics. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, a kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life." End of quote. The early Christians believed that the second coming of Christ was imminent. The last judgment was expected to take place in near future. It's important to realize here that Mark wrote the first gospel around the year 70, which was when the Palestine was besieged by Roman troops and the Jewish temple was destroyed, all of it resulting in an apocalyptic atmosphere of ruin. Even Paul is one of the first writers, even Paul does not yet speak of hell. He speaks only of the wrath of God that will fall upon the unrighteous. In the Gospel of John, only the righteous rise from the dead and have eternal life, whereas the wicked are brought to justice. In his treatise, The City of God, written in the year 413 to 26, Augustine was the first to postulate that the hereafter was a matter of fact. So that's important. Augustine is the most important church father, Kirchenvater. He was extremely important, but you have to realize the time. It's more than 400 years after the death of Christ. So it's a lot of time that passed. And only then, this for Christianity, so important vision of a hereafter was made to effect. But the hereafter is a realm of pure imagination. The juncture provides me with an opportunity to point out very clearly an essential aspect of thought processes involved in the approach to cultural analysis referred to in German as Kulturwissenschaft, whereas theologians and most art historians treat the hereafter as being a place that is not called into question as such. I say precisely from the perspective of cultural analysis or Kulturwissenschaft that the hereafter is a non-place that is filled exclusively by human imagination. This non-place is filled with images that are produced by human mind. But those same images then actually create reality. The concept that a society has of an afterlife has a decisive influence on how it views the world generally. Christianity was the first religion to systematize the notion of an afterlife. The afterlife has a clear structure, and that structure is dichotomous. There is heaven, or paradise, and there is hell. Tertium non datur. There is no third possibility. There are those who are good, and there are those who are bad. But then we have to ask ourselves just what that means. In my view, this construct of an imaginary space has had a strong influence on our Western structures of thought. Even in the case of those who have managed to rid themselves of notions of a last judgment and a hereafter. What is fundamental is the positing of an absolute dichotomy between good and evil. I will deal on this question of evil in the next lecture. The Church has accordingly elaborated instruments by means of which sinners, through the Church, and only through the Church, by confessing their sins and participating in other sacraments, can redeem themselves before they die. Because after death there is no repentance. The torments of hell are eternal. We know that the sale of indulgences, that is the practice of paying for the remission of punishment for sins, eventually became one of the reasons for the rise of Protestantism. For Luther, only faith and God's mercy can offer hope for forgiveness. So you know this sentence perhaps, sola fide, sola gratia. As for the structure of the hereafter, consisting of paradise and hell, we'll discuss that in the next lecture. Images of the hereafter become a means of moral education, whereby emphasis increasingly placed on the threat of punishment in the afterlife as a means of deterrence. The moment at which the decision between paradise and hell is made is the last judgment. It is in this that Christianity comes closest to the religion of ancient Egypt, which was also a religion that focused on the hereafter, as we have seen in contrast to Judaism and in contrast to the religions of the Greco-Roman antiquity, which both focused much more on life in this world. A fundamental concept both of the religion of ancient Egypt and of Christian religion is that of a judgment after death. Now I show you this Egyptian example. The concept of a judgment of the dead first appears in the religion of ancient Egypt, and it was a concept that centered on the notion of justice. Absolute justice could be the domain only of a divine authority. The concept of a judgment of the dead emerged in the 3rd millennium BC, a time of heightened class conflict in a hierarchical society characterized by extreme social inequalities there was a pharaoh and there were slaves. Justice cannot and should not exist in the world of the living. It is put off until life after death. Here we see how ethical questions and questions of power are connected. The ruling morality is the morality of those who rule. The pharaoh's heart, or Ba, appears at the judgment of the dead and is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. The image of scales will subsequently be adopted by Judaism, but also by Greco-Roman culture in the allegorical form of Justitia, or Lady Justice, eventually becoming an attribute of the archangel Michael, in Christianity. Isn't it amazing that in Egypt, in Judaism and in Christianity, the moral assessment of a person can be symbolized by the image of scales, an instrument that serves to indicate the weight of a merchandise? Such symbolism can emerge only in a bartering society, one in which fair exchange constitutes the ideal of morality. In contrast to Christianity, in the Egyptian kingdom, the question was not one of paradise versus hell, but rather of an eternal life, meaning a continuing life that resembled earthly life versus death, that is real death, non-existence, but not punishment. In the new kingdom, the final judgment is extended to include other people as well, as you see it here. This is a period in which the mortuary texts, collectively referred to as the Book of the Dead, make their appearance. These texts provide a precise description of just what is to take place, and especially they present a negative list of confessions, for example. You have to say, I have not committed murder, I'm not a thief, and so on. There are 82 questions that have to be answered correctly. In contrast to Christianity, innocence is not the central issue, but rather the ability to free oneself actively from sins. It is not a matter of faith, it's a matter of knowledge. In the late period, the pharaoh himself no longer has to answer for his deeds because he has become identical with Ma'at, with a goddess. He himself determines what justice and truth are. Up until the late Middle Ages, the Last Judgment dominates the Christian pictorial world. You have it everywhere. You have it in the entrance of the churches, almost on every church. You have it, of course, in book illumination. You have it depicted on walls, like this very famous wall painting by Giotto. You have it in altar pieces. You have it everywhere. And this is and then you have it here, where you see that secular and spiritual authorities are also sent to hell. This is totally ambivalent because, while it indicates an awareness of the culpability of those who exercise power, the handling down of just punishment is nevertheless reserved for God alone. So as you see, that's a very practical idea of religion. In early Christianity, people firmly believed that the second coming of Christ was imminent. But seeing time pass and not seeing Christ come, they found themselves confronted with something of a time problem. How were they to conceive the relationship between particular judgment and last judgment. The time span between an individual's death and the last judgment had to be bridged. The concept of purgatory was devised, but quite late, around the time of Pope Gregory I in the 6th century. He was the first to mention this at all, after 600 years. But it wasn't until the 11th or 12th century that it began to be defined as doctrine. So you have to imagine this like this. The saintly go directly to paradise, the wicked directly to hell. Only those who die in a state of grace go to purgatory, where they are cleansed of any sins they may have committed. So normally we all would have gone to purgatory. Consequently, penance becomes an important instrument. Donations made to the church, as well as special masses for the deceased, requested by family members, can shorten the time spent in purgatory. Beginning with Pope Gregory I, the doctrine evolves in linear fashion towards a tripartite concept of heaven. Hell, heaven, paradise, and purgatory, with certain details foreshadowing Dante. Christianity is a religion that has death at its very core. Nevertheless, as late as the late Middle Ages and well into the Trecento, that means the 14th century, death per se was not visually represented. What was important was, after all, the idea of overcoming death, or of living life in such a way as to be entitled to an afterlife. Death itself was merely the transition to another life, to an eternal life. All of this changed in the late Middle Ages, when the modern era was being ushered. Death takes the stage. One of the first personifications of death appears in Pisa's Camposanto around 1330-35. It's partially destroyed in the war of 1944. This was most likely the work of Buonamico Buffalmacco. Here, for the first time, we see a representation of the triumph of death. This was a spectacular pictorial invention, and one that had a lasting effect. For the first time in the history of art, death and the power of death over man are portrayed as a scene that is part of a vast pictorial panorama. The ensemble is an allegory of death, the last judgment, and hell. We have here only, I show you only the triumph of death. Painted on a wall of the cemetery, the fresco of the triumph of death was planned by the Dominicans, a mendicant order committed to put a tight moral rein on aristocrats and townsmen who had acquired wealth and to orienting them towards the salvation of their soul. Death came to be portrayed as the enemy of man. Death is a winged female figure. The figure's feminine character derives from the fact that both the Latin word mors and the Italian word la morte are grammatically feminine. La morte, wielding a scythe, swoops down on the living. Beneath her, a heap of dead bodies. In heaven, angels and devils are seen fighting over souls. The inscriptions on the accompanying scrolls remind the beholder of man's powerlessness in the face of death. They castigate wealth, knowledge, all the worldly ideals of court nobility and wealthy bourgeois upper class. dance. Falconry and idol get together in a love garden. What you see here, of course. Beggars and disabled persons are pleading in vain for death to come to them. Here, for the first time, there is a representation of the encounter of the three dead and the three living. This goes back to a legend of the 13th century and was then very often repeated. And what you can read is, here you see it a bit more in detail. What you read is, what you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be. In the early 15th century, representations of the dance of death, danse macabre, begin to appear on the walls of city cemeteries. Personified as a skeleton, death comes to fetch the living, and with complete impartiality. Men, women, children, the old, the young, regardless of social standing, the poor, the rich, the powerful, simply everyone. Here we see an indication of a new democratic awareness. In the face of death, all are equal. Everyone has to die. However, the dance of death remains embedded in the Christian faith, which always has the hereafter in sight. The first known pictorial representation of the scene of the dance of death was also the best known. Here, of course, you see only a copy of 1485 after an original painting of 1425. It's in Paris, in the Cimetière de Saint-Innocent, and it was very, very famous, and one thinks that the original drawing can perhaps be traced back to the entourage of Jan van Eyck. I show you a later example by Nicolas Manuel, but this also is not by himself, but is a copy. But I think it's quite a good copy, so one can have an idea how it looked like. It's in Bern in Switzerland. It was dated 1560 to 1520, so early in the 16th century. What is very special here is that Manuel depicted dignitaries who lived at his time, at his own time, very concrete personalities. And then what I think is quite fascinating, that he himself painted him with death, painting, and death already is behind him and fetching him too. Or we have this dance macabre, the dance of death by Notke, which is still in place. At the beginning of the 16th century, the dance of death is leaving the wall of the cemeteries and gets subject in graphic art. The best known example being the Dance of Death by Hans Holbein the Younger, published in 1538, a work that had enormous influence. Death insinuates itself into everyday life. You see that you have now very special situations, people who are playing cards, or the peasant, or nuns of the cloister, and the death, and so every individual has his or her very individual kind of death. In early modern times, the imagery of death undergoes a revolution. The individual confronts death as his or her own self. An outstanding example of this is the dry point entitled Young Man Meets Death, a work by the so-called master of the Amsterdam cabinet, dated around 1480. A young man in courtly dress with long curly hair is shown standing next to a figure that bears a feature both of an old man and of a dead man. Only the figure's left arm is depicted as skeletal. Due to this ambiguity between old age and death, the figure produces a disconcerting, uncanny effect and evokes associations with the process of decay and rotting. The old man, dead man, is seen laying his hand on the young man's shoulder. Draped over him is a cloth that he has gathered in his hand, a detail that is both decorative and symbolic. This cloth covers his genitals, a body part that is, on the contrary, highlighted in the case of the young man, although it is not actually the young man's genitals what we see, but rather his codpiece and the pommel of his dagger. The expression on the young man's face is neutral, neither frightened nor shocked by this strange encounter. The dead man, on the other hand, is gazing blankly into the distance. This representation of death does not evoke a transition from this world to the next. There is no last judgment, no heaven, no hell, no God, only the young man and death. Personified, death seen as the other self. Death seen as what the young man will eventually inescapably be. Death has, in a sense, come to itself. This new representation of death takes place in a new medium, namely graphic art. This new medium is one of multiple reproduction, a medium that is received in a totally different manner, that is no longer in conjunction with a theological text, as in the case of book illuminations, not in the religious context of a church, in the form of sculptures or mural paintings or altar pieces, panels. Rather, its reception takes place privately in a profane atmosphere. Medium and treatment of subject find themselves being suited one to another. This also holds true for the new medium of panel painting. Since the close of the 15th century, and especially in the first half of the 16th century, numerous variations of the theme of death occur, both in graphic art and in panel painting. Just how the encounter between death and man, which also means death and young man or death and young woman, is to be interpreted remains open. Different associations are possible. Of course, people are still living in their lives in the Christian context and know all about Last Judgment and its consequences. Nevertheless, in these individualized forms of representation, we see new ways of perceiving death being expressed. Death is no longer anticipated as merely a transition. Death is also apprehended as being the end of life, a horror, something threatening. The motive can certainly that certainly enjoyed the greatest popularity was that of Death and the Maiden, conjured up in the early modern era and then revived in the art of the fin de siècle. The antinomy of death and life, of fertility, desire and sexuality on the one hand, and the inevitable end of all beauty and desire on the other. This contrasted juxtaposition found an adequate form of representation in the motif of Death and the Maiden. In a work by Hans Baldung Green, sexual desire fuses with death. Manuel Deutsch has a very extreme graphic, as you see. Locked in a kiss, the woman gives herself up to death. Beham depicts ambiguous scenes that evoke various associations. The woman portrayed as Eve, the main culprit in the fall of man. The fall of man, lust and death. Death justifies by the fall of man by the sin of lust. However, sexual desire and mortality are treated in such a way as to be perceived as being elements of one's own self as well. In any case, novel images are no longer to be read simply within the context of the church theological and didactic discourse surrounding the notion of sin. Here you have another very extreme example. The increasing complexities that can be observed in the ways in which death was depicted can be attributed to a variety of interrelated causes, all of which had to do with the social, political, economic, and religious developments of the period around 1500 and generally in the 16th century. The church was no longer the sole vehicle of culture. The profane courts of the nobility as well as the urban bourgeoisie had begun to acquire considerable significance. The crisis of the Catholic Church reflected in the incipient Reformation and its conception of death and the hereafter, which diverged from established doctrine, had quite an impact on society, as did the discovery of America and, consequently, the discovery of unknown cultures, as well as the emergence of global trade. As early capitalist structures began to evolve, so did a market for art. It now became possible to sell art freely on the market, as it were. Artists now had the option of producing art that was not necessarily commissioned by secular patrons or the church. The media that particularly suited themselves to this evolution were, on the one hand, movable painted panels, and on the other hand, graphic art. New sciences were beginning to define themselves, and as a result, a new empirical approach to reality was in a general way becoming evident. It was no longer the church alone that determined how one was to think of the human body and death. These were no longer seen purely from a moral perspective, but also from one that was strongly influenced by what was soon to become the science of anatomy. Here we come back to the problem of whether it is at all possible visually to represent death. Most commonly, death is represented as a skeleton, as a dead person. As such, it is able to engage in all sorts of activities. There have also been artists who have used pictorial means to incite the viewer to reflect on the possibility of representing death, that is, on what is fundamentally the impossibility of representing it. I would like to draw your attention to the painting by Hans Holbein entitled The Ambassadors, Germany, die Gesandten, dated 1533. On the left side of the painting is Jean de Dinteville, French king's ambassador, who was in London for a brief duration. On the right is Bishop Georges de Selve, who was paying the ambassador a visit, evidently not on a political mission but privately as a friend. On the upper level of a two-level credenza we see a celestial globe and an astronomical instruments. On the lower level, a terrestrial globe, instruments used for measuring musical instruments, and two German books. The one on the right has been opened to a page with Lutheran hymns, an allusion to the effort made by both of these Catholic men of letters to establish mutual understanding with the Lutherans. Lying on the floor between the two men is an unidentifiable object. You see it in front, and you don't really know what it is. It is only when the viewer stands next to the painting and views it from the side that this object becomes recognizable. It is a human skull, which for the frontal view has been anamorphosed, that is presented so as to be seen as a distortion from this angle. As long as our standpoint is that of the living, as long as we are able to behold life, we are unable to see death. When we see death, life disappears. That is, we no longer see life's image. Baltrusaitis, this is an art historian, convincingly surmised that the spot originally chosen for the painting in Dinteville's Château de Policy was in a large rectangular room that had 2 points of access. As the visitor entered the room through one door, he found himself facing the living. It was only afterwards, when leaving the room through the other door, which was situated to the right of the painting, that he could look back and recognize the skull that had been distorted. Behind the curtain, you see this on top on the left, you see very small. Behind the curtain in the painting, we see just barely a partially hidden crucifix. Konrad Hoffmann, very famous art historian, in his seminal essay devoted to this painting, referred to this crucifix as Deus absconditus, that is, the hidden God. He views this detail in the context of endeavors on the part of both Erasmus and the Self to alleviate the conflict between Catholics and Protestants, and he remarks that many things remain hidden to the eye of man and become visible only after death. My view is this, I agree with this, but I also have another association. Imagining death by looking at a skull, and on the other hand, contemplating Christ crucified, that is, viewing death from the standpoint of the Christian faith, are two very different ways of looking at death. and they cannot operate at the same time. The one, a cold scientific approach that includes reflecting on the impossibility of representing death, and the other devout, reverent contemplation of the cross. Peter Bruegel the Elder, in his painting Triumph of Death, summarized the concept of death that prevailed in the late Middle Ages in all its facets. At the same time with his painting, Bruegel ushers in a new way of perceiving death. We don't know the original title of the painting. We call it a Triumph of Death, but we don't know whether this was the original title. We don't know who commissioned this painting, and we are not very sure about the date. One thinks that it is 1562 or 63, but it's not really clear. Over a dark pictorial surface that evolves upwards to become a landscape, Bruegel spreads out before the viewer the horrors of death. Individual fates dominate in the foreground. These then transition into death on a massive scale in the middle of the picture. In the background, at the top of the picture, the general destruction has engulfed nature itself. We see a desolate landscape marked by dead trees and fires burning everywhere. The iconographic sources have been thoroughly researched. An invention of the Italian Trecento, the motif of the triumph of death, is well known to us in its earliest form, as seen in the fresco paintings of the Camposanto in Pisa, which we have seen were dated around 1336. Moors, as we see here, depicted in the Camposanto, that was death portrayed as a winged female demon wielding a scythe, was soon to be replaced by the horseman of the Apocalypse, identified with death. I hope you can see this, more or less in the middle. You see this horse with death rising on the horse, and we have many examples before Bruegel where death was depicted like this. The main sources on which Bruegel drew were undoubtedly representations of the dance of death. In Bruegel's painting, as in the dance of death, everyone, absolutely everyone, is befallen by death. In the foreground, on the left, a king in full regalia is seen dying. His power and wealth are no good to him anymore. A skeleton dressed as an armored knight is scooping up his money. Next to them, another skeletal figure is propping up as cardinal, with its broad-brimmed head and its pose. This figure mimics the cardinal, death seen as the other self. A pilgrim, recognizable by his satchel and the scalloped shell on his head, is having his throat slit. His pious pilgrimage was no protection against the violent death. Mercenary foot soldiers, or landsgenets, in old-fashioned garb, are doing what they can to fight off the dead, but in vain. They themselves will soon be among the dead. Then there is a fool who thinks he can hide from death. Behind the table, the young lady, dressed in genteel attire, is trying in vain to escape death's grip, a detail that echoes the scene Death and the Maiden. Only the young couple, sitting somewhat apart from the other guests who had gathered here, seem to remain oblivious to death as they make music together. But death is lurking just behind them. Even infants have to die, like the little baby hanging over the edge of its mother's coffin, which is being towed by two skeletons dressed as monks. The third monk is seen behind them, falling dead to the ground. Broidery painting goes beyond the theme of the dance of the death, however. Not only do all stations in life, all age groups and both sexes fall prey to death, so do the various ethnic groups, as witnessed by the black man in the net, and animals too, sheep and cow, seen sinking into a hollow behind the infernal construction at the center of the painting. I'm sorry, I think you can't see this, but even if you stand before the original painting, you really have to look closely to see all these details. Bruegel also cites other forms of representation of death, such as, for example, the fates of ancient mythology, in Greek called the Moira, in Latin Arce. But in Bruegel's painting, Atropos, the fate who possesses the power to cut the thread of life is herself seen being crushed by the card of death. Clotho, the fate who spins the thread of life, is already lying dead on the ground. Bruegel's work differs from representations of the dance of death, not only by virtue of the fact that he has added other pictorial features to the scene, but also because no actual dance of death, as a unified action is taking place. There is no all-connecting narrative. In some isolated and exemplary fashion, Bruegel shows individually how people from the most various walks of life refuse to accept death. Since the late Middle Ages, we have known, especially from book illumination, death represented as a skeleton that performs various human activities. Death is, just a minute. Death as a javelin thrower, death as an archer, death as a grim rapper, a drummer, a bell ringer, a gravedigger. Death attacking the living. But in Bruegel's painting, death has been multiplied up 10 times. In the middle of the picture on the right, legions of skeletons are seen holding up coffin lids as shields, marching forth to kill the living. The later are being herded into an enormous coffin, a gigantic mousetrap. As dead persons, they returned to round up more of the living. It seems to be human beings themselves who bring death to human beings. And in all cases, a violent death. Indeed, the painting comes across as being one great picture of execution and slaughter. From A to Z, Bruegel goes through all kinds of death, with one significant exception. There is no peaceful death. Death comes unexpectedly, it is a violent death. We see the people refusing to accept it. They react to it with horror. None of them understand, none of them are prepared, none of them want to die. Here it becomes apparent what is missing in the picture, if missing is a word. What is absent here is a concept of ars moriendi. Ars moriendi, or the art of dying, was originally conceived as a book genre designed for use by the clergy in giving solace to the dying. Printed in the form of booklets, the ars moriendi were soon translated into the vernacular and illustrated with woodcuts. From the end of the 15th century on, they enjoyed tremendous popularity. In these little guides of dying, one was shown illustratively what the so-called good death was and what the so-called bad death was. The notion of a good death is of the utmost importance. A good death is in all cases a peaceful death. The hour of death becomes, in essence, the crucial hour. There is still time to repent. Once the sacraments of extreme unction and confession have been administered, the dying person, in spite of a life of sin, can nevertheless hold out hope for going to heaven. In Bruegel's Triumph of Death, there is no good death. Here, in contrast to the teaching of the Christian faith, death is not merely a transition, not merely a threshold between earthly and eternal life. It is in this that we see the most radical change. There is no sign here of a last judgment, no judge of the world, no paradise. All that remains is hell. But a hell that is a picture within a picture, that is in itself, in its entirety, hell. The infernal construction in the middle of the painting is mounted on wheels, which gives it the appearance of a theatrical probe, of something that is meant to evoke a human conception of hell. A few demons reminiscent of those of Hieronymus Bosch can be seen wiring about this constructed inferno, and significantly only here. Given the ubiquity of real death, there is little left for these demons to do. The master of events in Bruegel's painting is death, not God. In the entire Christian pictorial tradition, this had never been seen. Death represented without a hereafter, death without transcendence. This profane character that death was taking on also had a lot to do with the emergence of the new medium of panel painting. The painting is not an altarpiece. It is not part of a mural painting, nor is it a book illumination. Gone is the entire context, which means a place of reception such as a church or a cemetery, or in the case of book illumination, the frame around the illustration and the accompanying text. Bruegel's painting was viewed within a private framework. Unfortunately, there exists no concrete information concerning the person who commissioned the work or its early ownership. The medium of panel painting offered the very possibility of viewing the subject in this individual and innovative manner. But it's only a possibility. By contrast, Martin van Heemskerk, a contemporary of Bruegel, with his painting The Four Last Things, remained true to the Christian tradition. In this painting, Heemskerk combines a death scene and the Last Judgment. In this modernized form of the Ars Moriendi, the personifications of faith, love and hope, as well as a priest, are seen gathered around the bed of a dying man who, as if in a vision, sees before him heaven and cries in radiant splendor. He sees those, He sees those who are rising from the dead. He sees paradise and hell. Another example that deserves mentioning is here Georg Penn's Triumph of Death, inspired by the triumphs of Petrarca. And here you again see Death as a skeleton, but it's embedded in the vision of hell and paradise. Bruegel's secular apocalypse brings to mind in particular the writings of Sebastian Frank. Sebastian Frank was one of the most radical exponents of the Reformation. He wrote in the 1520s and 30s, residing in various German cities, from which one after another he was expelled or banished for his views. All of his writings were translated into Dutch and were well received in the Netherlands. In his Geschichtsbibel, historical Bible, Sebastian Frank assailed the traditional conception of hell, calling it Narei and Fantasie, nonsense and pure fantasy. Frank acknowledges an end of time, but not a last judgment. In his historical Bible, he describes the history of mankind as a repetition of catastrophes, man being, in his view, unable to recognize his mistakes. Allow me to quote Sebastian Frank, "For I see that this world is finished, that these recent times, grown so old, so dire, so turbulent, have become so wicked and reckless that they can only continue to pursue the false path they have chosen, not listening to reason, doomed to eventually run against the cornerstone and crumble to pieces." End of quote. With Frank, eschatology becomes social and religious criticism. So you see, I see an analogy between this scripture of Frank and Bruegel. So one can see that this kind of thinking was possible in that time. Bruegel's younger son, Peter Bruegel the Younger, who spent his whole life doing nothing but copying his father's work, was unable to endure this conception of death that lacked Christian definition and hope. By adding the crucified man, I'm sorry that it is not very sharp, the picture, but you see it is in the background to the right side. By adding a crucified man to the picture, he was bringing a Christological element back into the context. The inscriptions on the two scrolls along the lower edge of the painting make reference to the apocalypse, more specifically to the horsemen of the apocalypse, and to man's return to his eternal home. Peter Bruegel the Younger repaired, so to speak, the clock, the instrument for measuring of time, that Bruegel the Elder had brought to stop. In the father's painting, there is only one number on the clock, namely the figure 1. 1 means death. In his son's version, however, we see the complete normal set of numbers on the dial, and it is precisely 5 minutes before 12. In other words, there is still time to repent. Peter Bruegel the Younger mitigated his father's radicalism and placed death back into an eschatological context of meaning. This was not merely a personal decision on his part. In 1626, the year in which he produced his copy, Antwerp was again firmly under Habsburg control, which meant it was again under the dominion of the Counter-Reformation. The revolutionary phase of the 1560s, marked by various decidedly radical reformational and humanistic currents, was a thing of the past. In the research, art historians also seem to have trouble accepting the radicalism of Bruegel's painting. And they endeavor to see in the work a theologically founded didactic lesson intended for mankind in its sinfulness. For instance, a book by Pavlak, written in 2011, which was a monograph on this painting, she shares the meaning that this is absolutely Christological correct representation. As analysis has shown, however, it is not so much a didactic admonition as a reflection on death, violence and war that we should see in this painting. A reflection like that of the skeleton down in a melancholy pose, pondering over a dead bird. You see this skeleton pounding his head in this melancholy way and reflecting on this dead bird lying before him. In the countries of the Counter-Reformation, the 17th century saw the production of forceful paintings depicting the Last Judgment, but especially overcoming of death, predominantly as the Assumption of Mary. I don't show you this because we don't have the time. In Northern European art, especially in that of the Netherlands, which were largely Calvinist, visual representations of religious subjects and in particular images of saints were forbidden in the church context. Nevertheless, the theme of memento mori and the vanitas genre played a very important role. Reflections on the transitory nature of things are expressed in the form of concrete objects. Vanitas still lives treats the theme of death in the form of allegories. I show you now a very interesting painting by Geisbrecht. Geisbrecht was known for his excellence in the technique of trompe-l'œil. He was from the southern Netherlands. He was from the southern Netherlands and he worked predominantly as a court painter to the Danish royal court in Copenhagen. What we are looking at is a roughly sanded wooden wall on which there is a shelf. And on this shelf stands a frame over which a painted canvas has been stretched. The painting does not completely cover the frame. However, and one can see that it has been attached to the frame by means of a spring. Two oval medallions have been hung on the wall, and the third that has been set on the shelf is leaning up against the wall. Two of these medallions bear male portraits. The medallion in the middle appears to be unfinished, which possibly suggests that the artist's work was prematurely interrupted because of death. Hanging on one of the pegs that hold up the shelf is a painter's palette, from which the paint is still dripping. Hanging on the other peg is a vial, filled with oil as well as a wiping cloth. A vial containing turpentine is seen hanging on a nail, and on the same nail rests a spotted malt stick. Written on a cartello is the name of the artist and the city name, Copenhagen. The entire painting is a trompe-l'œil, And within this tremblay, on the surface of the painted canvas, is another tremblay, namely a slab of marble that seems to be jutting out from the picture. On this slab, on the left, is a brass tankard, which also gives the illusion of extending beyond the surface of the painting. Propped up against an hourglass that has fallen onto its side and that is lying on a handwritten letter is a skull surrounded by garlands of dried straw. Here is a candlestick holding candle that has been blown out. One can just barely make out a bit of smoke still rising up from it. There is a pipe and beneath it some tobacco wrapped in paper. Tobacco that will no longer be smoked. Behind the pipe is the neck of a violin. In the upper left portion of the painting, a bubble is vaguely perceptible. Other bubbles can be seen on the seashell lying in the foreground to the right of the skeleton. These all are emblems that belong to the iconography of vanitas. The picture within the picture is beginning to detach itself from the frame. The upper right-hand corner of the canvas is seen hanging down loosely. This can be interpreted as a signifying the vanitas of vanitas itself. Everything is transitory, everything including art. Here I see yet another possible interpretation. The fact that the picture within the picture is detaching itself can be a reminder that this is a painting that was done by someone, and at the same time it deconstructs, as it were, the illusionist trompe-l'œil character of the picture. As a result, one finds oneself realizing that everything here is, after all, a painted picture. The painted picture constitutes a reflection on the very nature of the art of painting. But this reflection also allows the viewer to realize that this picture of death is precisely that, namely, just a picture, with the word just in quotation marks. It is one human conception of death. What one feels as one contemplates a painting is not the fright of death, not horror, not a moral admonition, but rather fascination. Fascination with the illusionist effects, fascination with the perfection of the way in which the various material surfaces of the object have been reproduced as a pictorial ensemble. We have not the time to sketch the further evolution. However, I would like to show you one more radical example of an artist grappling with the subject of death. It was only in the late 19th and the early 20th century that an artist was able to confront the subject of death, specifically the death of a loved one, without embellishment and without any way evoking transcendence. The artist in question was actually one who would not normally have been expected to approach this subject in this way. It's a Swiss painter, Ferdinand Hodler, who came from the Jugendstil and symbolism, and then later works exhibiting expressionist features. Ferdinand Hodler, who lived from 1853 to 1918, grew up in poverty. His father and mother both died of tuberculosis when he was a child. All of his siblings died of tuberculosis, also when he was young. In 1908, he met Valentine Godet-Darel, who was 20 years younger than him. She became his mistress, but he remained married. In 1913, shortly after giving birth to their daughter Paulette, Valentine Godet-Darel was diagnosed with cervical cancer. On January 25, 1915, she died of her illness. In his painting entitled The Night, I'll show you this again, in German Die Nacht, Hodler, given his numerous early experiences with death, had treated the theme of death artistically, but he had done so in his symbolist allegorical style. Now, however, he had set about dealing directly with the illness and death of the woman he loved. He made 18 paintings and more than 120 drawings have survived. The artist destroyed many of his drawings. It wasn't until 1976 that the entire cycle was put on an exhibition. I had the opportunity to see this exhibition, and it's incredible because here I can only show you some examples. When you see the whole, it's really something. In the history of art, there exists nothing comparable. An artistic grappling with the process of dying, a pitiless documentation of death. He draws her, he paints her, sometimes several times a day. He paints her in her dying agony, he paints her dead. We have to limit ourselves here to only a few examples, but the entire series conveys a far more oppressive impression, because only the entire series enables the viewer to feel subjectively the progressive deterioration, the intensifying pain, and the growing despair. Hodler concentrates on the face and sometimes on the hand as well. The body, to the extent that it is shown at all, disappears under the white sheet, as for example in the oil painting dated 1914. Color is used to give prominence only to Godet-Darel's hair, her slightly opened lips and the 3 roses. The rest of the painting is a surface that varies from one shade of white to another, a feature that conveys the eerie emptiness of the scene. The 3 red roses seem to be floating in mid-air, which can be a suggestion that life has just left her. The small clock above the roses is a reminder of the passage of time. I show you some further examples. In the gouache, which was painted only a few days before Darel's death, not only has her condition deteriorated dramatically, but also Hodler's manner of painting has changed. Her gaunt face, open mouth, and closed eyes betoken death. Her body and the space surrounding it seem to dissolve into abstract, expressionist brushstrokes, blurring the boundaries between things and evoking associations with pain. The landscape paintings from the year 1915, the years of Godet-Darel's death, come across as being an echo of the dead. Just horizontal surfaces, nothing vertical anymore. The pouring out of emotion is expressed in the colors used. I find it remarkable that when confronted with the death of the person he loved, that when going through his harrowing experience, the artist no longer had any use for all the flourishes and allegoric idealization characteristics of Jugendstil and symbolism. As an artistic form of expression, allegory with its abstract aspect cannot adequately convey such an existential individual tragedy. For all the variety of ways in which death has been interpreted by pictorial means, it is always the death of others that is in question. To visually represent one's own death is impossible. Thank you.